Dan Glazebrook, the journalist, political analyst, author of Divide and Run, regular contributor to Russia Today TV, and he's discussing Ukraine, NATO, Russia and ISIS.
Okay, everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to start by talking about in the 1980s there was an organisation set up by the SAS in the north of Ireland called the Forces Research Unit. And at the time its existence was denied by the British government for many, many years until finally they were forced to admit it when one of their own inquiries revealed its existence. And what the Forces Research Unit, led by a man called Gordon Kerr, what they were basically doing was recruiting, organising and running loyalist death squads in the north of Ireland to basically wage war against the Republican community. And as was, we're still finding out more and more about the huge number of loyalists that were actually involved in the Forces Research Unit that were actually working for British intelligence at the time. And what it was a way for the British state to wage their war, their colonial war in the north of Ireland, using locally recruited violent sectarian militias, and keep it all kind of unofficial and off the books, and they can still present themselves as the kind of peacemaking mediator in the middle and so on. And this was actually part of a broader strategy really that was adopted in the 1980s by the US and the UK, kind of in response to the Vietnam War and its repercussions. So with the Vietnam War, very similar to the Iraq War, it became very difficult after the US failure in Vietnam, very difficult to openly kind of conduct these kind of large-scale mass ground operations and occupations and so on. And the kind of failure in Vietnam in the 70s, the 70s were really a period where the kind of resistance forces against neocolonialism, against imperialism, were really making a lot of ground throughout the world. You had the whole liberation movement across southern Africa, you had Angola and Mozambique shake off Portuguese colonialism, you had the movement in Ireland, you had the ANC, the PLO all making waves and so on. And the US and Britain, they obviously needed to launch a kind of counter-offensive against this kind of surge of resistance to their global domination. But they couldn't do it in the old Vietnam occupation type of way. There wasn't a public appetite for it. And besides, it nearly bankrupted them. So in the 1980s, you saw this kind of strategy emerging of using developing violent sectarian forces to use as a kind of counterweight and to actually wage war on your behalf. So we saw not only in Ireland, with Gordon Kerr, but we saw in Afghanistan the recruitment of the so-called Mujahideen to launch war against the communist PDPA government in Afghanistan. And in 1996, we know from Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, that the US actually began arming the so-called Mujahideen, the anti-communist fighters in Afghanistan, 6 months before the Russian invasion, that they'd always, at the time, justified their support for the Mujahideen, that they were responding to a Russian invasion. Carter, what Brzezinski admitted, was no, they originally started funding that insurgency in order specifically and deliberately to provoke a Russian invasion, which they succeeded in doing. Then at the same time you had the death squads, the Contra death squads in Nicaragua. So this kind of strategy of using proxy, kind of sectarian violent militias was really kind of coming of age in the 1980s and being really systematically adopted, with these kind of militias being integrated into part of kind of US and British military. So, of course, it wasn't a new strategy. The whole British Empire was really built on what we call divide and rule strategies, which is basically the same kind of thing of finding what are the fault lines in a society and cultivating kind of groups who have a problem with their neighbouring tribes and so on, and then use them as a kind of conduit for colonial conquest, basically. That's how the empire was built. So this is not a new strategy, but it's once again coming to its own since the failure of the occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq. So again, we're in this similar to this sort of post-Vietnam situation where the US military is, to use Colin Powell's words, pretty much broken, and they're just unable to launch these kind of costly and expensive and demoralizing occupations. So we're seeing return to this 1980s strategy, and it's no coincidence that Gordon Kerr, the Forces Research Unit I opened with, they popped up in Basra in 2005, I think it was, 2005, when briefly they actually made front page news because two of them were arrested dressed as Arabs with a car full of rudimentary bomb-making equipment, on their way to some local market or whatever, right? Just at the time as there was all of these bombs going off in markets that was labelled as sectarian violence, but actually no one was claiming responsibility for, which is a bit odd. So they popped up there and they were arrested by the Iraqi police at a checkpoint, and I don't know if you remember the story, but what happened is the British Army actually bulldozed the prison they were being held to rescue them. The other, several hundred prisoners escaped in the process and so on. So that whole unit was moved to Basra, to Iraq. And then since then, of course, we've seen this kind of proxy strategy developing, these sectarian groups being a key means of facilitating so-called regime change operations in Libya, Syria, and also in Ukraine. And that's what I want to focus on here with Ukraine. So just to kind of recap the sort of timeline of events in Ukraine the last few years. So in 2010, you had the election of a man called Yanukovych as president. And his policy, it's an interesting thing in Ukraine where since independence the majority of the public has always been hostile to not necessarily hostile to NATO as such, but hostile to Ukraine being part of NATO. Because Ukraine has such deep historic ties with Russia. The population itself is kind of divided between those who want a more multicultural type of Ukraine that recognizes the kind of the Russian side of Ukrainian national life, and then the kind of the Ukrainian nationalists who don't recognize any of that. But the majority of the population have been opposed to NATO membership. Yet their governments and the elites have always kind of wanted to be part of NATO. And that changed in 2010 when for the first time you had a president elected specifically on a manifesto promise of not being part of NATO and a kind of neutral foreign policy, where he wanted to have trade links and good relations with Europe and Russia, but be actually tied into some kind of military agreement with neither, right? So a kind of independent foreign policy. And at that point, he was wanted to develop a trade agreement with the EU, and the negotiations have been underway for many years. And then it came to on the verge of signing it in late 2013, and in the end he walked away from the agreement because, quite gratuitously in my opinion, the EU had inserted parts of that trade agreement, inserted into it, commitment to, aligning Ukraine's security and defense policy with the EU and increased military cooperation with the EU, right? Which his whole mandate was specifically not to get involved with that. And we've had lots of experience of actually the EU being used as a kind of stalking horse for NATO. Nearly all the countries that have joined the EU have subsequently gone on to join NATO. And so he couldn't accept this agreement, he refused to sign it. And that's when you got all the protests, people saying, oh look, he's pro-Russian and so on, because in the end he did sign the agreement with the Russians, who made no such demands. And you got the protests underway in the Maidan. Did get violent, and then you had this particular day of violence on the 20th of February when 56 people were killed by unknown sniper or snipers on both sides. 17 police killed and 39 protesters. And we now know from leaked conversation between I think it's Catherine Ashton, the EU foreign policy chief at the time, and the Estonian foreign minister, there was evidence around that both of them had access to, that it seemed that it was actually people on the opposition side who were firing the shots, which would make sense because by then what started as a kind of protest movement had definitely by mid-January or so been taken over by armed neo-fascist militias. That's pretty clear. Intent on the violent overthrow of the government, which is exactly what they achieved. So on the 21st of February, the day after these sniper shootings, there was an agreement reached, in fact, where Yanukovych said he'd bring forward the elections and he would form a coalition government with the opposition. He'd withdraw his police from the Maidan where the protests were happening, which was the crucial part, and that the protests themselves should disarm because they were fully armed by then. And the Maidan protesters refused to accept it, and the following day he was basically overthrown in a coup because the police did withdraw, and after that the armed demonstrators, the militia, basically just stormed the parliament and stormed the presidential buildings, government buildings, and took over. And the EU and the US immediately recognised the government, immediately promised 100 million in aid and so on and so forth. And just to give you a kind of flavour of what this new government was about and who it involved, some of their new policies in those first few days, some of which were subsequently withdrawn but too late, but the first few days saw this new government instituting a number of revealing policies. They lifted the ban on Nazi insignia, which many of the perpetrators of the coup were openly displaying. They repealed the law that allowed Russian to be declared an official second language in various parts of Ukraine. They made moves, and including the president himself talked about he was going to try and ban the Communist Party, which had received 13% of the vote in the previous elections, and the Party of the Regions, the former governing party, and talk about very far-reaching lustration laws, basically purging anyone connected with the former government. That could have affected up to about 1 million people. So these were the kind of laws. No surprise really that these kind of laws were being instituted, because within the new government you had 5 members who could be basically described as kind of neo-fascist. So Svoboda, I just want to read you a quote, if I can just get it a moment. Svoboda, one of these parties. So Svoboda was set up in 1991. It was originally called called itself National Socialist Party. Its historical hero was Stepan Bandera, whose portrait had been hung behind the speakers throughout the Maidan protests, incidentally, who was an enthusiastic participant in the Holocaust, thought to have rounded up and killed about 4,000 Jews in Ukraine. Initially allied with the Nazis, later sort of fell out with them, but very much in that political tradition. The Svoboda party leader, Tianbok, said of Bandera's people in the war, said they did not fear, but took up their automatic rifles, going into the woods to fight Muscovites, Germans, Jewry, and other filth. So this is the kind of party, and the EU recognised this party for what it was, because when they won some seats in 2012, the EU issued a statement that called on all the other parties in Ukraine not to, quote, not to associate with, endorse, or form coalitions with this party. Nevertheless, this party got 3 seats in the new government that the EU supported and immediately recognised as legitimate rulers, although they'd come to power in a coup. They got the role of Prosecutor General, Defence Minister, and Vice Prime Minister. You then had the right sector, an even more extreme kind of street militia, basically, who got Deputy National Security Chief, and the post of the actual National Security Chief went to Andrei Parabuy of the Fatherland Party, another far-right organisation. And one of the things that he immediately did was set up something called the National Guard. The following month, in March, he set up the National Guard, which was basically a paramilitary wing of the army that would integrate the fascist militias involved in the coup, integrate them, put them on the government payroll, and use them for ends that would very shortly become clear. So obviously these kind of policies didn't exactly win over the trust and sympathy of the ethnic Russian minority in Ukraine, because they had neo-fascists openly dedicated to wiping out ethnic Russians within the government. And they had a whole load of policies that kind of signaled their intent to that end. So that was the context in which Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, and these other regions in the east and south of Ukraine basically refused to accept the authority of the coup government. And Russia eventually, as we know, annexed Crimea, and the eastern regions basically said they refused to accept the new government's authority. So that was the stage at which then this new government basically launched a war against the ethnic Russians in the east and the south. And what was really interesting, and the relationship with the US and the UK really interesting, is that at first this war that was launched in April of 2014, at first it went very badly actually. In the first 10 days, the Ukrainian army faced mass desertions, mutinies, people leaving the army, refusing to fight, refusing to fire on the who were now to be termed rebels in the east, and actually, in some cases, literally handing over their equipment and their personnel carriers and their tanks and so on to the people in the east, and they didn't want to fire on their brothers, and they didn't support this new government either, and so on. So it was going very badly. And what's interesting is that the Prime Minister Yatsenyuk began for the first time, since coming to power 2 months earlier, began for the first time to talk in more conciliatory language about the ethnic Russians within Ukraine, talking about maybe there needed to be a federal kind of Ukraine negotiations and so on and so forth, the need to respect the rights of ethnic Russians. So it looked like the stage was being set for the Ukrainian government having very quickly come to its senses that there's no military solution here, and that they need to negotiate and produce something a bit more amenable and alleviate the fears, the very justified fears of the ethnic Russians in the east and the south. That was the point in which you had two very high-profile visits from two US officials. You had Joe Biden going over, swiftly followed by the CIA chief, Brennan. And obviously it's not on the public record, I don't think, exactly what was discussed with the Ukrainian government, but what we know is very shortly after they left, two things happened. One, the offensive was renewed, and secondly, the fascist militias, many more of them began to be set up by billionaire oligarchs. On the 2nd of May, you had the Azov militia set up. I'll just tell you something about that. They were formed in May, just after Brennan and Biden left, by a man called Beletsky. He's also the head of a group called the Social National Assembly. And in his words, he said, "The historic mission of our nation in this critical moment is to lead the white races of the world in a final crusade for their survival, a crusade against the Semite-led Untermenschen." So my suspicion, this brigade was set up, immediately integrated into the National Guard, given a couple of weeks training and sent to wage war on the ethnic Russian population. And my suspicion is that Biden and Brennan, what they were saying was, don't negotiate, relaunch the offensive and use these fascists. You've got these guys, they're ready to go, they're deeply committed, they hate the Russians, use them. Your own army is not committed enough, use these guys. Because that's exactly what happened. So they left, the offensive was renewed, and you know, in a way that the rest is history. There's now a death toll of estimated about 8,000. The very latest ceasefire signed on the 1st of September of this year does more or less seem to have held and been holding. But what I want to do in the remainder of this talk is to think about, well, why exactly? Because it seems to me that the US has been deliberately cultivating, and they put tens of millions into this National Guard, which is, like I say, a paramilitary fascist organization. Why? What exactly are they trying to do? Now, obviously, they're trying to weaken Russia. That's kind of pretty obvious. Specifically as well, I mean, there have been people in the US, the neocons and so on, calling for, you know, people for whom the Cold War never ended. Russia is, always will be the enemy, right? But particularly after August 2013, when the US-UK bombing of the Syrian government was scuppered, I think there were some in the US administration who really felt the need to punish Russia and weaken Russia after that specifically. Because if you remember August 2013, allegations of the Syrian government using chemical weapons, Obama had already said it was a red line and he would go to war with the Syrian government if this was the case. There was all of this pressure on Russia and Iran to basically back down. It was the US and UK saying, look, we're going to do this now, so get out of the way because we're going in. And they sent the Saudis to Russia, presumably to try and bribe them and threaten them with smashing oil prices if they didn't go along with it, which is exactly what happened afterwards. But they didn't back down, and Russia and Iran said no, and they had to climb down. I think it was Lavrov who said that eventually it was Putin had to suggest the way for them to stay face, climb down and disarm Syria's chemical weapon stock without war. I think it was Lavrov who said that the US has climbed up a tree and can't get down or whatever because they made all these threats. They haven't worked, and Russia helped them get down. So they've never been forgiven for that, for standing firm on the Syria issue. And don't forget as well, Brzezinski, who I mentioned before, who's the architect of the whole policy of using sectarian so-called Islamic extremism as a counterweight to Russia in the 80s. He's now one of Obama's foreign policy advisors. And so, this is the guy who said, when he was interviewed in 96 and admitted that they were supporting these guys before the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, he was asked, well, this was before 9/11, but it was after, I think, the Al-Qaeda attacks on the US embassies in Africa. And he was asked, well, do you kind of regret now spawning this global terrorist movement that's now sort of coming back to bite you? He said, well, what's a few stirred up Muslims who brought down the Soviet Union? Who cares? So that's his attitude, and that's his kind of strategy. And I think they're trying to do something similar now, destabilizing war right on Russia's border. And another part of it, of course, is weakening Russia through basically bullying, using the Ukraine crisis as a means of bullying Europe into supporting sanctions on Russia. So there was no support in Europe before the Ukraine crisis for a kind of US-led economic war against Russia. But the Ukraine crisis allowed them to twist their arm into getting involved in that. So weakening Russia is part of it, but the point is as well for the US and for Britain, it's also about weakening Ukraine itself. It's obviously destabilizing Ukraine, which means the economy's gone down the pan. 2014, the inflation rate was 100%, over 100%, which makes Ukraine ever more dependent on the IMF and these international financial institutions. I read recently that Ukrainian debt now stands at $100 billion. In just 5 years ago, it was something between 10 and 20, I think. So, what's the interest on that? There's going to be 5, 6, 7, 8 billion a year. And just straightforward wealth transfers to the richest countries. So they're getting ever more dependent on the West financially and militarily as the war goes on. US officials, this came out in a Senate inquiry, a US military official admitted that US officials are embedded in the Ministry of Defense in Ukraine, basically calling the shots. So there's creating this new military and financial dependency through the war in Ukraine that they've unleashed through these fascist death squads. But finally, as well, it's also aimed at weakening the EU. It's aimed at weakening Europe as well. Because remember that the neocons and the Project for a New American Century, by the way, the Deputy Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, is married to one of the key architects of the Project for a New American Century. Their whole thing is that any rival power, any potential rival to US power needs to be smashed down. Whether it's a regional rival or a global rival. And again, Brzezinski's kind of key point to maintaining US hegemony in the 21st century was Europe and Russia must not be allowed to become close. That is the key, because once they do, then US power is finished. So, again, like I say, it was by stirring these things up in Ukraine was the only way they could actually force the Europeans into joining in an economic war against Russia, which is hurting Europe almost as much as Russia, right? And now you get all the European capitalists up in arms about wanting to end sanctions. And what's really interesting, you look at MH17, the downing of the passenger jet last July and all of this, and you can see that Germany was not going along with this kind of economic war against Russia. They were saying we don't want more sanctions, we want good relations with Russia, etc. It's their main export, one of their main export markets, so on, heavily energy dependent. And then you get this kind of strange turn of events where for several weeks the Ukrainian military and the National Guard start using civilian planes, including a Red Cross plane, to fly their fighters into the east of Ukraine, right, to fight. So that's happening. So it's known that civilian planes have been used to transport soldiers. At the same time as actual civilian planes haven't been anywhere near the area for months. They've all been diverted. So you've got the situation where the only civilian planes actually in the area are not really civilian planes at all. They're transporting soldiers and paramilitaries. And then you get this strange MH17 gets diverted by Ukrainian air traffic control to go through right across the war zone, which all the other planes have been diverted past for months, at a much lower than normal altitude. Oh, and it gets shot down. So I know there's theories about maybe the Ukrainian government shot it down itself. For me, whoever shot it down, it seems like a setup. And Germany seemed to realise that as well, because their first comment after it shot down was, well, of course, this is terribly tragic. Immediately followed by, but we're not going to do any new sanctions still, thank you. They knew that the US was going to try and get something heavy that would force them into going along with sanctions, but within a week they reversed their position and they supported these new heavy tier 3 sanctions. So who knows what pressure was brought to bear during that week behind closed doors. But so just to finish off, the EU have been stupid here because they've gone along with this. Their Eastern Partnership program, so-called, set up in 2009. Like I say, it's part of the NATO expansion to contain and encircle Russia. It's been a stalking horse for that, very clearly. No coincidence that during this whole time of the Eastern Partnership, it's been Britain who've held the position of Commissioner on Foreign Affairs. And the EU have gone along with it. They didn't have to insert those clauses, like I say, about military cooperation, just in order to sign a trade deal and make the trade deal unsignable, which was obviously going to stir up that more pro-European portion of Ukrainian public opinion. All very foreseeable. So they've gone along with it, and now you've got the situation where actually all three, including the Ukrainian government, Russia and the EU leaders, and Germany in particular, they can all kind of see what's going on. The war's not helpful for any of them, and I think they all want to kind of reach some kind of settlement, but it's now it's taken on a life of its own with these paramilitaries. Every time there's a law passed they don't like, they literally surround the parliament with guns and hold them at gunpoint and say you need to pass this law, which is what they did with the lustration law. So they're the kind of wild card that they can scupper any peace that's made at any point, and the US has been deliberately cultivating them, and precisely for that reason, in my opinion, so that they can continue to keep this war ongoing. But obviously, I mean, we haven't had time to talk about much how Russia's involvement in Syria kind of changes things and all of that kind of stuff, but maybe we can look at that.